The words made me cringe. They were spoken after a meeting for worship by a very sweet Quaker lady with the sweetest of intentions, but they made me cringe. Your children were so good. They were spoken to a non-Quaker mother of two small children who had sat quietly in their chairs for much of the meeting. Maybe the words were received positively by the mother. Really, it was the message behind the words that got my attention. If I take a moment to hear them from the perspective of a doubtful parent, quiet equals good. If quiet equals good, does that mean when my kids are squirmy and noisy, we aren't welcome? My kids are noisy a lot. Maybe I'm reading too much into this. It's one thing, not a big deal. If the mother is thinking about whether being Quaker is for her family, she's going to look for more clues. The clues she finds may be spoken or not, visual, what's on the walls, does she get invited to anyone's house for dinner? Is she accepted for herself? Can she bring her whole self? Can she bring her kids' whole selves? The clues available to her make up the culture of the group. The sweet Quaker lady who complimented the good kids has kids of her own. When her kids were little, she probably had the same worries about being accepted. But complimenting the quiet kids as good is participating in a particular culture. Instead of saying, your children were so good, I can think of other words that could have been said to the mother. Your kids seemed to pick up on the spirit of what was happening today. Those words carry a similar intent, but they include an awareness of how the mother may receive them. Maybe you can think of similar words that would take into account the mother's circumstances and view of the world. New York Yearly Meeting supported a project this past fall, winter, and spring that centered the needs of parents. As I read a report from that, I reflected on my own family culture. In the early years of my marriage with Bronwyn, when we visited my parents, our evening activity was to watch movies together. When our first child was born, that changed. We would just put the infant down in the middle of the floor and watch. Each new thing the kid did brought discussion, joy, debate. Our life together, our family culture, centered around the youngest. The report was about the parent support groups. That project, the parent support group project, was one of the responses to our request for proposals to support children and their families. Emily Province organized groups of parents from across the country and beyond. The volunteer facilitators were mostly from New York Yearly Meeting. Callie will report more on that project and the others later this week. But I want to just read part of the report. Meetings need to make a decision. Are we a community for all ages or a community designed to serve middle age plus adults? One of these is not inherently superior to the other, but many meetings are being the second while claiming to be the first. These two types of communities require entirely different approaches and full commitment from everyone involved. You cannot be a community for all ages if your middle-aged plus adults consistently prioritize their own needs and preferences over everyone else's. And many Quaker meetings in the United States function exactly that way. Being a community designed to serve middle-aged plus adults is not wrong, but being that while claiming to be an all-age community lacks integrity. I raise this now because it is something that every person that has been in one of our children, youth, and young adult field secretary positions over the last dozen years has noticed and talked about. They can work with their constituencies, but they keep coming up against a community that, mostly unintentionally, undermines what its intention to welcome young parents, young adults, children, and teens. Our culture undermines what we say we want. And now that I've mentioned staffing for children, youth, and young adults, it seems like a good time to share where we are. Last fall, this body approved a budget for this year that included enough funding for a full-time position to support children, youth, and young adult programming. For a variety of reasons, I've had a hard time moving that forward. But now I can say that I expect the position to be posted in August, probably mid-August. It will be posted as a full-time position. There are good reasons for part-time positions, and for two part-time positions, there's good reasons for one full-time position. And I do love resolving difficult problems, but sometimes there's more than one right answer. And I think this is one of those. As a reminder, when the Personnel Committee first proposed this back in 2018, it was not just a full-time position, but it also included some very part-time coordinators like the Arch model. I started thinking about these projects, these proposal projects that we've had as coordinator type work. So in a sense, we have been doing some of the coordinator part of this, but not yet the full time. Now, even though you are all on mute, I can hear some of you asking, but what about Marissa, who is currently serving as New York Yearly Meetings interim part-time young adult field secretary? Marissa and I talk about this from time to time, about this eventual transition. And though neither of us knows exactly what the transition looks like yet, it will be just fine. Marissa continues to be a blessing with both her work and her flexibility. And now, as we stand poised, ready to hire someone to serve New York Yearly Meetings needs for children, youth, and young adults, I want to remind you that this person will be fantastic, but not perfect. They will not be able to fill every need. We have to decide what we each can do to support that work. We can be open to changing, can we be open to changing the things that we do that undermine what we say we want? And while I'm on the topic of young adults, did anyone notice anything special about the meeting for discernment? When the steering committee turned its attention to finding clerks for the 4 different sessions, the first 2 clerks proposed in the committee were young adults. And then someone on the steering committee said, could we? And everyone else said, let's try. So all 4 clerks for the meeting for discernment were young adults. About 14 years after that infant first sat in the middle of my living room floor, Bronwyn and I were informed that we should start using a different name and different pronouns of another gender. It took me about 6 months to decide that I wanted to change pronouns, and another 6 months before I could do it automatically. Habits and culture, changing them takes time, attention, and effort. Saying I love you is important, but it is undermined if I also refer to you in a way that doesn't account for your authentic self. My meeting embraced the new pronouns quicker than I did. Not perfectly, but well enough that my child felt reasonably comfortable. I wondered how this new reality would go with my politically conservative extended family. To my relief, they put family ahead of what I know their church teaches. And to be clear, this wasn't just tolerance or acceptance. This was embrace. Several years later, Bronwyn and I got the child said, the now adult child said, you know, those two genders aren't working for me. I need to go somewhere in between. And so we had to started learning they, them pronouns. It's a deeper truth, progressively deeper truth. Our meetings, our yearly meeting, our communities are in the midst of a lot of change. Gender fluidity is just one of those. We're all very familiar with the pandemic and the changes that it brought on. The technology changes to our worship brought on by the pandemic. And another change that's amidst us all around is white people talking about racism. Getting back to normal is looking backwards. A spirit-led community is forward-looking. How are we called into wholeness? I want to invite you into an examination of Quaker culture. I want to invite you to root out the parts of it that don't belong, the parts that do not serve us, the parts that undermine our intended love for each other and that cause separation from God. To give you an idea of what I mean, I want to talk about four examples, four small examples of Quaker culture. We have a phrase, "That friend speaks my mind." The way that I believe it's intended and that I do often hear it used is a simple, humble, that person just said what I would say. The way I sometimes hear it used in yearly meeting sessions is in a tone that says, usually after some tension, when we've been working on a tense issue and somebody says, "That friend speaks my mind," and maybe several others join in on that. And my goodness, is that shutting down somebody that might feel differently? I don't think that's the intent we want. We have we have a term, weighty friend. That term sometimes means that person who consistently gives a message that seems to capture where we are, who opens us. But it can also mean that person who we don't question very much. We just need to think about which way we're using it. If I say there is that of God in everyone, I am using one of the quintessential Quaker phrases that describes who we are, what we're about. It's very central for us. But if you say Black Lives Matter, and I immediately follow it with there is that of God in everyone, I have just undermined what you said. I have gone more with an all lives matter kind of message. And that's not the message of Black Lives Matter. It's Black Lives Matter too. We have a term, birthright Quaker. Birthright, there's nothing wrong with being a birthright Quaker. In fact, that's great. And it can mean that I've been in this for a long time. I also see it used as I'm a birthright Quaker and therefore you should listen to what I'm about to say. Both ways. These are small examples, small compared to the other things that we're doing. There are things that we have been changing, that we have been choosing to change to address our culture, to address some of these things. Pay as led is a big one. We are changing the economics. We are opening it up so that people can pay what they want and do not have to ask, do not have to jump through extra hoops in order to participate in our activities. We have been adding pronouns to our screen names and our name tags as a way of opening up. our understanding of gender. We have more white people saying, we are starting to say white people instead of we when we mean white people. In our meetings for discernment, we are starting to hear voices from our members who are in prison. Those voices have shifted in the meetings for discernment. And we've been starting land acknowledgements. We've been doing land acknowledgements. And so with some of these things we discerned in advance, and in other things we're just trying them and then we're discerning or moving toward that. So there's now frequent talk of the relationship between European culture and Quakerism. European culture is also intertwined with a system of white supremacy. It is a culture and a system that Quakers inherited along with our faith. None of us asked for it. We are all affected by it, though many of us are only beginning to understand it. I do not find it helpful to think of a person such as myself as racist or not racist. Sometimes I act that way. Sometimes I act racist. Sometimes I act anti-racist. I find it more helpful to think of ourselves as working together against a system of oppression that none of us asked for. Working against a system of oppression that our deepest truth tells us is wrong. During the meeting for discernment, we were reminded that in a crisis, the friend who shows up and says something wrong is better than the friend who does not show up for fear of saying something wrong. I invite you to a next step. I invite you all to join me in training to understand the system of oppression we inherited. None of us can do this alone. We can only get so far by reading books. We need to develop shared understandings, shared vocabularies, so that we can examine what parts of Quaker we need to keep and which ones are undermining our intentions. This isn't just for white friends. We've all drunk the Kool-Aid. 5 years ago, the yearly meeting set and achieved a goal of having at least 100 people attend the White Privilege Conference. It's time for a similar goal. Let's have at least 100 people from across the yearly meeting attend a deep anti-racism training. I'm talking about a training that's the size of a weekend. We'll need to find an equitable way to pay for everyone, but we have a good model for that. There are not yet specific dates, and there will likely be more than one opportunity. And if you want to know more about what that looks like, Thursday at 3:30, that's what's on the afternoon anti-racism agenda. I appreciate the opportunity to continue this journey with you. Thank you.